now going to call this meeting to order, 10:30. Here to sign, discuss Shoshone County Drug Task Force Memorandum of Understanding with our honored guest speaker, Mr. Ben Allen, here to tell us what's going on.
Perfect. So for purposes of background context and giving you a little better understanding, are any of the commissioners familiar with what the Drug Task Force is?
I think, but I'm not even sure.
Well, I will start in the simplest fashion possible then. So, in Idaho, our legislature allows for what they call multi-jurisdictional task force that center around law enforcement. Those task force can have a number of areas of emphasis. Common one we see here in our region is the North Idaho DUI Task Force. So sometimes that's in the news where law enforcement will do emphasis focusing on targeting drunk drivers. And these task force can be set up and structured as a collaborative agreement between different law enforcement agencies within a jurisdiction. There are a number of benefits of setting up a task force for law enforcement, one of which is it allows those agencies to pool and collaborate confidential information that will enable them to better attack and address certain areas of crime. It also provides a mechanism by which law enforcement agencies can provide resources and assistance in a specific area for a specific purpose in order to be able to conduct operations that otherwise wouldn't be possible, just due to manpower or otherwise. A third and not as common acknowledgement of task force is there is a provision of Idaho code, that code being 37-2732K, that allows for the disposition of criminal actions to include a restitution payment to a structured or set up task force that can then help to offset the cost for the particular goal or purpose of that task force. And because of that, we have the ability to take money from criminal cases that would otherwise go into the general state coffers if a case was resolved and a defendant was ordered to pay fines or fees, and we can identify or earmark certain money out of that to go to a drug task force, and by doing so we provide direct access to that money for the agencies that make up that multi-jurisdictional task force who otherwise wouldn't have access to that. For instance, if a criminal case is resolved in the court system and an individual, by virtue of the resolution of that case, is ordered to pay $500 in court fines for their criminal case, a very, very, very small percentage of that actually comes back to the county specifically. And if you want those exact numbers, I know Tammy can pull those, but for purposes of dialogue between us today, suffice it to say that it's a very small amount. So most of that money goes back into state coffers, gets used for activity that's outside of our county. Now, cities, if there is a criminal case that comes from a municipality, so not the county, cities are able to recoup a larger amount of those court costs than the county is able to. So for cities don't have quite the same, and I'll call it a loss for better terms, because it costs hundreds or even thousands of dollars to prosecute a criminal case all the way to the end, and oftentimes defendants will wind up with a judgment that only requires them to pay a few $100s in fines or fees. So fighting crime, generally speaking, it's a spendy endeavor, and what the county gets back from the final disposition of that is very, very minimal. So what Shoshone County set out to do a number of years ago is, pursuant to the statutes that allow for it, Shoshone County set up a drug task force. And by setting up a drug task force, what we were able to do is we were able to pull all of the law enforcement agencies together here in the valley to create this collaborative task force that allows those agencies to share information amongst each other that would otherwise be confidential intel that the agency retains, and utilize that information to better be able to fight crime. On the backside of that, it also provides a mechanism by which we can petition the court, instead of dispositioning a case with fines and fees, to disposition a case with restitution to our drug task force, which means that in our hypothetical, if the court orders a $500 fine as part of a criminal disposition, the county would see just a small fraction of that. If we can convince the court to order $500 of restitution to our drug task force instead, that $500 comes directly back here to the county in full. And we have the ability then to utilize that money for the goals and missions that the task force was set up for. The drug task force has to be supervised and monitored by a specific entity, and so that entity historically has been the prosecuting attorney who has taken the reins on getting that set up. It's been in existence for quite a few years, and it has been quite a few years since we've actually revisited the MOU that was in place between the various agencies. Upon recognizing how out of date that MOU was, I received a request as legal to tackle the job of redrafting that MOU, getting it up to date, revising it to better reflect our processes and procedures that are in use here in Shoshone County, and providing a final proposed draft for all of the entities to then execute. So what the commission should have, which I sent over a few weeks back, is a revised draft of that MOU. It looks like this. It's quite a bit longer than the original, and it outlines the structures for that drug task force. At the end of it, you'll see a signature line, and it contemplates the BOCC signing off on it. Really more so to demonstrate that all of the parties understand that this drug task force is in existence. The BOCC's authorization of a drug task force isn't required by the code, but I thought it was prudent to demonstrate that everyone's on board with our drug task force continuing. To date, drug task force funds we've been able to use to help offset the budgets of not only our county, but the various cities that are participating in it, by incurring expenditures that otherwise benefit our law enforcement agencies and their personnel, without having to dig into each one of those entities' individual budgets. Some of the things that have been pursued in the past. Just this month, we were able to train 3 different local officers in Cellbrite technology, which is technology that allows them to do forensic downloads on electronic devices. Those trainings are very expensive, and because we were able to commit funds to pay for multiple officers to get that certification, Cellbrite actually allowed us to then host the training for officers throughout North Idaho. So they hosted that training, I think, 2 weeks ago in Kellogg, and because we were the host, because we could put that money up front, they actually gave us free tuition for our 3rd officer, so we only ended up having to pay for 2 of them. And that's a pretty big deal, because those trainings cost about $10,000. So that's that was huge. So
Yeah.
that's one example of what these funds can be used for. the commission may not be aware, but Osborne PD now is the host of a virtual training system, which allows officers to go into a training room with live scenarios that are simulated with lights and sirens, and work on best practices for use of force with simulated firearms. That entire system was able to be purchased using Drug Task Force funds. It's currently being housed by Osborne PD, and it's being utilized by any of our agencies upon request. So that's another use of these funds. And then going back some time, I even recall years ago, I was able to attend training as a prosecuting attorney that otherwise we would have had to come out of our county coffers for training funds for, and we were able to offset that with Drug Task Force funds. So there's a number of mechanisms by which we can use these funds, but at the end of the day, in layman's terms, the best use of funds that the Drug Task Force provides is by giving us the leverage to pull money that would otherwise be going to the general state coffers by way of fines and fees, and drafting creative resolutions as the prosecuting attorney to try to get money by way of restitution into this fund for our agencies to use.
What agencies are part of this task force?
So under the new proposed MOU, every one of our policing agencies here in the valley would be a part. So we've got Shoshone County, City of Osborne, City of Kellogg, City of Pinehurst, and on the county side of things, we've got both the Sheriff's Office as a participant and your prosecuting attorney as a participant.
Okay.
So state police are not a part of it?
They're not a part of this task force, no.
Now, do you guys do any forfeitures, like personal property or anything like that?
So there are forfeiture statutes in Idaho, and so that is a mechanism by which we can leverage resources. I think our forfeiture statutes in Idaho are likely gonna see some revision here in the very near future.
Good or bad?
The general sentiment is that there's a push to do away with forfeitures. I don't know how much traction that's getting these days, but I do know that that's been a push for about a year or two now to do away with the civil mechanism of forfeiture as it relates to a criminal case. But as of right now, we do still have civil forfeitures that are available. We do utilize them here in Shoshone County. It requires us to actually open up a civil case proceeding. So we have to file essentially a separate lawsuit on top of the criminal charges. And then that civil case actually gets opened up, gets its own case number, has its own hearings, and for all intents and purposes, it becomes a whole new client matter for purposes of prosecution.
So it's kind of case by case if the assets that you're looking at is worth the time and money to go after.
Yeah.
Okay.
And because it's a civil matter, I mean, there are upfront costs we incur in those. I mean, we've got to provide notice of the hearings, just like you would for any civil case filing. We've got to draft our petitions and complaint documents for that forfeiture. We've got to verify personal service for any named defendants. And then the other piece that kind of comes into that is oftentimes we'll see forfeitures in our jurisdiction. If they involve a large amount of money, ISP is going to take those under the code if it doesn't meet their threshold, because they have certain standards of what their threshold is, and they'll kick that down to the county and allow the county to pursue the forfeiture instead. And typically speaking, we do as long as we can financially justify it.
Okay. Any other questions? Anything else you'd want to share with us on this?
The updated MOU has been distributed to all of the cities as of this last month. I know a couple of the cities already put it on their January agendas and approved it, so I've got some executed documents from those. The county's one requires, contemplates a signature from the commissioners, from the sheriff, and from myself. So if the BOCC doesn't have any other questions or concerns, I'd request that the BOCC entertain a motion to approve the MOU as drafted and executed, and I can ensure the sheriff and myself do the same.
Is the sheriff on board with, as written? And
Yeah, and we've already got the drug task force in place, as I mentioned. The drug task force representatives, we meet quarterly, and so it's already up and running. This is really just a revamp of the old MOU that was in place.
Well, Chair would entertain a motion.
I'll make a motion to approve the
I'll
drug
second
task
it.
force.
Sign the understanding. Second, motion seconded. Any further discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. None opposed. Motion carries. We are with you.
It's good.
Thank you.
Okay.
You bet.
Appreciate the
Yeah, really
extra
appreciate it.
efforts you're doing there
Yes.
to, I participated as a reserve officer in the drug task force years ago.
Did ya?
So,
Well, good.
so it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it does. And like I said, I think it's a great way to help provide some padding for our local law enforcement budgets too.
Exactly, yeah.
And we appreciate that.
Yep.
So thank you for
Certainly.
taking, for taking time.
You bet. Do you guys have a copy to sign? If you don't, I can.
I gotta be honest with you, I probably gave that to someone who's not here anymore, so.
It's okay. I've got one if everyone wants to
Okay,
execute it,
perfect.
and I can just take it back with me. Once I get all of the executed copies to Jasmine, I'll send you a final.
As long as all we're executing is copies, and nobody else.
Just one page.
Yep.
Okay.
Open it up for a minute if there's any public questions. Ben, any comments or questions from the public?
I'm thrilled to have this going on.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it, Jennifer. All right. Okay, seeing none, then I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Motion adjourned.
Second.
Seconded that. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, motion adjourned. Signature. And thank you for taking the time.
You bet. It's my pleasure.